Hello and welcome to Introduction to Programming Variables and Data Types. You will use variables and data types in virtually every program you build, not just JavaScript, but every program. It's what is the holding tank for our data so that we can work with data and work with information. So let's dive right in. Now, one thing that I would encourage you to do as we go throughout the semester is take a moment to review from the previous week and what you've covered. And if you have questions, reach out to me. Drop me an email, Skype, ask in class and lab, or what have you. And think through what is one thing that we've learned. Was there anything that was confusing that we need to go back over? Let me know that and we can do that. I would also encourage you to, if you have available your Introduction to Programming textbook, which is just the JavaScript, Head First JavaScript book, there's some code in there from the rock and the house code that's very good as far as getting your feet wet with JavaScript programming. So if you have questions on that, let me know. Now, I want to talk about how we work with JavaScript data types and how JavaScript does it and how other programs do it. All programs have data types, and JavaScript's a little different than some of the other programs you may run into. Now, in the Head First JavaScript book, there is on page 36 and 37, there is a picture they have there where they're basically talking about how all the data types we use emulate real-world objects. For example, Boolean, on, off, yes, no, true, false. That could be a light switch, or that goes on and off. We have numbers all around us. We have arrays around us, objects around us, text around us. So all around us in this world we have objects that are of a certain data type. So we can, in programming, emulate those as much as possible. Now, the ones you're going to use the most often are text or string, number / integer, Boolean. You're also going to work with arrays quite often and objects, but that will be later on in the semester. And then there's some specialized undefined nulls, which means they don't really have a data type, but they just haven't been defined yet. But the first three you work with the most: string, integer, Boolean. So let's talk about each of these. First of all, a string. A string is just that, it's text. Usually you have it defined in quotes. Now, one of the things I want to point out that JavaScript is currently, I believe the latest release is 1.8. It's built on ECMA, an ECMA language. It's what's called an ECMA compliant script. There's several scripting languages that are built on top of ECMA, like ActionScript, which is what is the language that drives Flash applications and things. So JavaScript, it's what we call a loosely typed language, meaning I can create this var response. I can say that it's a string, put a string value in it, and then I can turn around and put a number in it. And so we need to make sure we are careful with how we work with things, because especially when it comes to numbers, because we could say I want to add 5 plus 10 and we could get 510, not 15, because we're adding text instead of numbers. So we got to be careful with that. There's other languages like Java and C# and some other ones that are what are called strictly typed languages, meaning when you create a variable like var response, you have to tell the program this is a string variable, or this is a number, or this is a Boolean. And if you go to try to put in a different data type in there, your program is going to warn you about that and say, "Nuh-uh, not going to work. You can't do that. You can't put a number in a string," and so on. Number is just that, it's a number, so you put it in without a quotes. Now, if I take like my first one there and say var n1 equals 12.00 and I put quotes around it, that will now become a string. So it's just written without the quotes. Boolean is true, false, yes, no, on, off. So that's how we could do that. Now, I want to talk just briefly about arrays. We're not going to get into arrays really heavy until later on this semester, but I just want to introduce you to that data type so that when we get into them later on the semester, you're like, oh, okay, I remember covering these, sort of thing. Arrays, what you do is you take a variable and you say, hey, this is a new array. And then what you do is you can put multiple pieces of information in there, and that's just what an array is. It's the ability to have one item, one variable, and have multiple pieces of information in there. So in this case, Chevy, Ford, or Dodge. Here's another way I think about it. if those of you that you may be familiar with an accordion file folder, so you have a folder that has multiple slots in it that you can put files in. That's what an array is. It's one object, one item that you can put multiple files in slot 1, slot 2, slot 3, slot 4. Now one thing to keep in mind though is that arrays are what are called zero based. So if you see here I have cars bracket 0, that's the first slot in our file folder in our array that's holding Chevy. Cars 1 is our second slot holding Ford. So everything starts off zero based, 0, 1, 2, as we go through our file folder of array information. We also have objects or structures or structs. You work with these a lot when you're doing more advanced JavaScript stuff with Ajax and hitting servers and third-party web services and stuff like that. This is actually objects is one, and working with JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, is actually one of my favorite types of data to work with because I think it's pretty intuitive. All it basically means is that you can have multiple pieces of information similar to arrays. It's just a different structure. You can use .object notation to access that. So first name John, last name Joe, ID 5566, and they're stored in the item a variable called person. So you can say person dot last name, and that would give you back Doe. So just we won't work with those too much in this class. I just want to make you aware of them. You'll work with them more when you get into client-side web scripting. And then we have some special ones like undefined or null, which means you've either told it there's no value by null, or you haven't defined a value. We want to avoid that as much as possible. So the rule of thumb is to assign values to your variables right away in your programming. Now, declaring data types. Again, I mentioned that JavaScript is a loosely typed language. So you've already seen me do code where I do var some variable and that's it. And that's perfectly fine. You can also tell it what type of variable it is, what the data type. So var car name equals new string. And so I can tell it that. Now I will tell you that that is not a general accepted practice yet. There is talk about having JavaScript be strictly typed, and there are actually some libraries out there, JavaScript libraries, that enforce that. Normal JavaScript does not at this point. There's nothing stopping you from doing, var car name equals new string. That would work. You wouldn't have any issues. Some code formatters may say, hey, that's usually not done, sort of thing, but that's okay. Just remember that all variables are objects, and so we are just creating variables and putting stuff in them. But I just wanted to show you how you can actually tell it what type it is. But again, it's loosely typed, so I could say var car name equals new string, turn right around and put a number in there. Now, one of the things I will point out, I have a note there about the camel case. Anytime you have a compound word, the uppercase, the first letter of the second word is an uppercase, so the camel, the hump, that's why they call it camel case. So variables, this is where we store stuff. Every time you create a variable, you want to create a name for it. Make sure it's a name that makes sense, so it's not obscure, so you understand when I look at that variable, I understand what information is in there, what it's used for. We initialize it with the equal sign. So we say var car name equals Chevy. And our car name will have the word Chevy in it. Now, you don't always have to initialize it with a value, but it's a good idea to do so you can avoid undefined errors. What I sometimes do, and what a lot of programmers sometimes do, is define it to a set of defaults that you can then change as you go through your code. Newer thing in JavaScript, released in the last couple years, has been constants. Basically, these are values that don't change. So you have, instead of var keyword, you use a const keyword. So constant name, and then I have there a string, I am stubborn. You can't change that at all. So anytime you want a value of something you don't want to have change, you can use the const, the const keyword. Again, I mentioned this earlier, camel case. There's upper and lower camel case. Lower camel case is usually what we use in the industry for our variables. Other languages besides JavaScript may use upper camel case. That's perfectly fine. Each language has its own little nuance differences. So again, initializing data means we got to put stuff in there, otherwise we get undefined. I mentioned that just briefly a moment ago, but get in the habit of doing that right away. Now, occasionally you will get an error like this, NaN, which stands for not a number. So if I have an item like there, I have subtotal equals 0 plus 12 times question mark, that's going to result in NaN because question mark's not a number. Anytime JavaScript is doing some sort of calculation and it's expecting to get a number back, if it doesn't, it'll give you back NaN, not a number. This is where we need to make sure we do the right typing, like when we get information back from an end user and things like that, or maybe we're storing the wrong information in a variable and so on. So anytime you get NaN, not a number, just check your variables and make sure that your variables are actual numbers. I mentioned this briefly before. Whenever you use the plus symbol, that has more than one capability. It has addition, like 1 plus 2 equals 3. It also has concatenation, north plus central equals north central. So if you have numbers that look like numbers but they're actual text, 1 plus 2 may not be 3, it may be 12. So we need to make sure we convert them properly. There's the number function that you use quite a bit. I use that quite a bit. There's also parseInt and parseFloat where you can convert a string to an integer or decimal number. Now, a couple other things that you need to know about. I've mentioned this before, but JavaScript, usually you don't learn it as a standalone because it's part of what I call the three-legged stool of web applications. You have HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So there are going to be times where we got to interact with our HTML page. And HTML has this thing called the Document Object Model, or the DOM. So we can slice and dice our document up and grab things and add things to the page and stuff like that on the fly from programming. So there's a couple things you're going to see me do as we go throughout the course that you're just going to get in the habit of doing. So if I want to grab an item from my page and do something with it in my JavaScript code. So for example, I have an input tag, which is just a form text field. And let's say I have an ID of some ID. In my JavaScript code, I can say document.getElementById SomeID.value. So I'm saying go into my document, find an element with the ID of some ID, grab the value that's in that element. So whatever I've typed in there. So you'll use getElementById quite a bit to grab things from form object and things like that from a whole bunch of your pages. In fact, you'll get in the habit, if you do web applications for any length of time, you'll start putting IDs and stuff on about everything so you can grab it with your code and do stuff. Now, another thing is validation. We're going to do some basic validation here. You'll do more in client side. But we want to make sure that what we're getting from our end users is what we want. There's a lot of validation that we can use and techniques we can use to make sure we're getting the information we want. There's some that's built in to the JavaScript language, but there's also some libraries out there and stuff that you can use. You can even build your own custom ones using regular expressions if you want. But for example, we have isNaN, where we can say that what that method does, it's built into JavaScript, is it's checking to see whether a value is a number or not. So isNaN, if is this not a number, is saying if that returns true, it returns Boolean, true or false. If that returns true, then what you're working with is not a number. You can also check whether to see if a field is empty or not with just empty quotes. You know, if is a value of this variable equal to empty quotes. That means there's nothing in it. And then there's some others that we'll cover at a later date, but I just wanted to show you and introduce you how you can check and use code to check whether an end user, what they put in, is what you want. We will also use the function keyword to create a lot of functions. You're going to create a lot of functions in here. Now, in JavaScript, we use the term function. In C# and other languages, they use the term method. They're very similar in nature, some nuanced differences. Basically, all it allows you to do is group a bunch of statements, programming statements together that make sense, that's logical, that works together. Now, one thing that you want to make sure you adhere to is there's a principle in OOP called SRP, which stands for single responsibility principle. When you create a function, that function should exist for one purpose and one purpose only. It shouldn't have duplication of purposes, because that, if by violating the SRP principle, we basically adhere to another principle that is non-OOP called WET. We keep WET, which means we enjoy typing. So if you're going to type enough, don't have to redo it and do stuff over and over again. But you use the function keyword, and then you name your function with some parentheses after it. We could even pass parameters to our function to have it do some stuff. And then within our curly braces, we have it do some things. So in this case, this particular test function just simply alerts the phrase "my function works" to the end user. And then we just want to make sure we use the right structure, the curly braces and things. So just make sure you pay attention with that structure, how it works. And then we'll work with a bunch of functions as we go throughout the class. And so you'll get pretty adept at working with these. Another thing is logic. You work with flowcharts and diagrams and things to make sure that you're logical. But you'll do like if statements. If this is equal to that, or if not, do this. If it is, do that. You can even do compound else ifs and things like that. So you can do a lot of checking about whether your logic works. If this is true, then do that. If it's not, so it's false, do the other thing. So there's ways to do that. There's also some built-in functionality with our JavaScript language, and JavaScript is not alone in this. There's built-in functionality to Java, C#, and all languages out there. It allows us to make our job easier so that we don't have to hard code a lot of this stuff. Like we've already worked with alerts, allows you to pop up a message. There's several. I'm not going to go through all of them. We'll work with prompt, we'll work with number, document rights a lot, things like that allow you to do certain things in the language that you would have to hard code out if they didn't have it. The other thing is that any of these functions we can actually store inside of a variable. A function, all a function is a fancy variable. So we can store a function in a variable and then call that function by calling that variable. Now, why might you want to do that? May make it a little easier than retyping a bunch of stuff all the time. And so there's times where it makes it easy, it makes sense to do that. Now, let me show you a couple things. So here I have a variable myString equal to new string, and again I could have just done it like that if I wanted to. And then myString equal to this is some text. I could have also done it like this. Okay, and it would work. So then I have a first number, second number, and a total. My first number is equal to 10. My second number is equal to 12. My total number is equal to first number plus second number. Notice they are strings. So I can write that out. Let's see what happens here. Oops, I forgot I have a, get rid of that. So I am the first text value. I am the second string value. Oh, now I have a third string value. I'll explain that in just a moment. But see how this is concatenated and it's not giving us back 22? That's because these are strings. We'd have to convert them to numbers. Now here, this shows how I can add and change my values of my variables. So I have a response, I'm the first text, and then I assign a new value to it, and then I assign a third value to it, and I'm just alerting the same variable every time. Let me comment this out and uncomment the next one, which is numbers. So here are the numbers, and let me just refresh my screen so you can see that. So here's the number 12, 12, 23, 0.0013. So you can do scientific notation, things like that. And then Boolean true or false, that would just show alert true and false. And then here arrays, let me show you this one. Actually, I'll do the Boolean just while we're here. So true, false, Chevy, Ford, Dodge, Ford, Nissan, Mazda, Toyota, and then undefined. So let me recomment these. Okay, so here I have my cars array. In the first position I have Chevy, Ford, Dodge. So when I first alert just my variable, it's going to show Chevy, Ford, Dodge. There, Chevy, Ford, Dodge. Then I'm saying cars 1, which is right here. So it should return Ford. Right there it is. And then I have makes, and I'm just passing data to it in line. So the first one should return Nissan, Mazda, Toyota because I'm having the whole variable show up. Nissan, Mazda, Toyota. And then makes 3, if I do that one, it says it's undefined. Now let's look at this. Remember, I talked about how arrays were 0 base, 0, 1, 2. So Nissan is 0, Mazda is 2, or 1, Toyota is 2. There is no makes 3. That's why it returned undefined. So whenever you see undefined, just make sure you have data actually there. You have a value in a variable. Okay. Well, that's about it for variables and data types. I threw a lot at you, but dive into the learning plan. If you have any questions, let me know, and happy coding.